On a cold November morning in 2006, the Trenton Police Department received an anonymous tip that would uncover a disturbing case in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey. The caller, whose voice was barely audible through the static of the phone line, provided information about suspicious activity involving a stepmother and her teenage stepson at a residence on Maple Street in the suburban neighborhood of Lawrenceville, just outside Trenton. Detective Darren Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Special Victims Unit with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too much, was assigned to investigate. At 43, Mitchell had built a reputation for handling sensitive cases with both tenacity and compassion. This case would test both qualities to their limits. The Lawson residence stood at the end of a well-maintained cul-de-sac, a two-story colonial with blue shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn. It projected an image of suburban perfection that belied the secrets allegedly hidden within its walls. As Mitchell approached the house that morning, notepad in hand, neighbors peered through curtains, sensing that something was amiss in their peaceful community. Robert Lawson, a software engineer who worked remotely for a tech company based in California, had been widowed 3 years earlier when his wife Cynthia succumbed to breast cancer. Left to raise their son Tyler alone, Robert had struggled to balance work demands with single parenthood. Then Vanessa entered their lives, a vivacious 34-year-old from Naples, Florida, with flowing auburn hair and a warm smile that seemed to promise healing for the grieving family. The couple had met on an online dating site 18 months ago, and after a whirlwind romance conducted largely through video calls and weekend visits, Vanessa relocated to New Jersey. They married in a small ceremony 6 months before the anonymous call reached the police department. Mitchell's investigation began with routine background checks. Vanessa Lawson, née Reynolds, had worked as a substitute teacher in Florida but hadn't secured employment since moving north. Her social media accounts portrayed her as an enthusiastic new wife and stepmother, posting family photos from trips to the Jersey Shore and holiday celebrations. Nothing immediately suspicious emerged from these initial inquiries. The detective's first interview was with Tyler's guidance counselor at Lawrenceville High School. Ms. Patricia Keller had noticed concerning changes in the once outgoing 16-year-old's behavior over the previous months. Tyler used to be involved in debate club and track, she explained in her office, surrounded by college pennants and motivational posters. Since the beginning of the school year, he's withdrawn from both activities. His grades have slipped, and he seems constantly distracted. When asked if Tyler had mentioned any problems at home, Ms. Keller hesitated before responding. He's been vague, but he did mention feeling uncomfortable around his stepmother. I assumed it was typical adjustment issues with a blended family. The investigation took a significant turn when Detective Mitchell obtained a warrant to examine the family's electronic devices. The judge had been reluctant at first, given the limited evidence, but the nature of the allegations and Tyler's behavioral changes at school provided sufficient cause for concern. The digital forensics team discovered the first concrete evidence on the family's shared computer, a series of deleted browser searches that raised serious red flags. Vanessa had researched topics about age of consent laws in different states, particularly comparing Florida and New Jersey statutes. More disturbing were searches about relationships between stepmothers and stepsons, along with inquiries about whether communications with minors could be traced through various messaging apps. Further investigation revealed that Vanessa had created multiple email accounts and social media profiles under different names. These accounts were used primarily to communicate with Tyler when his father was at work or traveling for business. The messages recovered by the forensics team started innocuously, discussions about school and hobbies, but gradually evolved into increasingly inappropriate conversations. Detective Mitchell also discovered that Vanessa had been taking Tyler to therapy appointments that Robert believed were helping his son cope with the loss of his mother and the adjustment to their new family dynamics. In reality, these appointments never existed. Instead, Vanessa and Tyler would spend those hours together at a small apartment she had rented under a false name in a neighboring town. Credit card statements showed purchases of gifts for Tyler, expensive headphones, limited edition sneakers, and video games, items that Robert assumed were joint presents from both him and Vanessa. These gifts appeared to be part of a calculated grooming process, establishing a secret bond between stepmother and stepson. The investigation intensified when Mitchell interviewed Tyler's best friend, Jason Hernandez. Initially reluctant to betray his friend's confidence, Jason eventually revealed that Tyler had shared disturbing information about his relationship with his stepmother. "He told me that Vanessa was different when his dad wasn't around," Jason explained nervously. "He said she would come into his room late at night to talk, and that she told him they had a special connection that no one else would understand." By the second week of the investigation, Detective Mitchell had compiled enough evidence to bring Vanessa in for questioning. Rather than arresting her immediately, he chose to observe her behavior and potentially gather more information through an interview. Vanessa arrived at the police station wearing a conservative blue dress and minimal makeup, projecting an image of wholesome domesticity. During the initial questioning, she maintained her composure, expressing confusion about why she was being investigated. She portrayed herself as a caring stepmother trying to help a troubled teenager through the ongoing grief of losing his mother. "Tyler and I have become close," she acknowledged with apparent sincerity. "He needs a mother figure in his life, and I've tried to provide that stability for him." When confronted with the evidence of the false therapy appointments and secret apartment, Vanessa's demeanor changed subtly. A flash of calculation crossed her face before she claimed that Tyler had been struggling with drug use, and she had created the ruse of therapy to help him privately without disappointing his father. This explanation quickly unraveled when Mitchell revealed they had already verified that Tyler had no history of substance abuse. The most damning evidence emerged when the forensics team recovered deleted photos and videos from Vanessa's personal laptop. These files documented inappropriate interactions between her and Tyler, leaving no doubt about the criminal nature of their relationship. The timestamps on the files indicated that the abuse had begun within months of Vanessa moving into the Lawson home, well before the marriage to Robert had taken place. As Detective Mitchell prepared to make an arrest, he made the difficult decision to interview Tyler directly. With a child psychologist present and all proper protocols followed, the teenager reluctantly confirmed what the evidence had already revealed. His testimony, given through tears and long silences, painted a picture of systematic manipulation and exploitation by someone who had entered his life during a period of vulnerability. Robert Lawson, when finally informed of the investigation's findings, collapsed into a chair at the police station, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "I thought she was helping us heal," he whispered, voice breaking. "How could I have missed this? How could I have brought this person into our home?" The case, which had begun with an anonymous tip on a cold morning, now had irrefutable evidence and victim testimony. As Detective Mitchell prepared the arrest warrant, the team discovered one final chilling detail. Vanessa's browser history showed research on countries with non-extradition treaties with the United States, and she had recently applied for a passport under her maiden name. Time was running out. The surveillance team outside the Lawson residence reported that Vanessa had left the house with a large suitcase, heading toward the local shopping center. It appeared that their suspect was preparing to flee, making the next few hours crucial for the investigation team and for justice. As Detective Mitchell assembled his team for the arrest, he couldn't help but reflect on the devastating impact of Vanessa's actions. A family already fractured by loss had been manipulated and exploited by someone who had promised to help them heal. Now they would have to begin the painful process of recovery all over again, this time from a betrayal that none of them could have anticipated. The detective's phone rang. It was the surveillance team. Vanessa Lawson had just purchased a one-way ticket to Cancun, Mexico. The flight was scheduled to depart in 3 hours from Newark Liberty International Airport. The race to catch her before she escaped the country was now on, and the clock was ticking. As Detective Mitchell and his team raced toward Newark Liberty International Airport, the pieces of Vanessa Lawson's past began falling into place like a disturbing puzzle. The urgency to apprehend her before her flight to Cancun didn't prevent the investigation from continuing on multiple fronts. A separate team had been dispatched to delve deeper into the background of the woman who had so skillfully infiltrated the Lawson household. Vanessa Reynolds Lawson had cultivated an image of the perfect stepmother, supportive, understanding, and patient. Her social media presence showed a woman dedicated to building a new family, with carefully curated photos of family outings and home-cooked meals. Yet beneath this crafted facade lay a history that painted a vastly different picture. Born and raised in Naples, Florida, Vanessa had grown up in a middle-class household with parents who were both educators. By all accounts from former neighbors and classmates, she had been a quiet, studious child who excelled academically but struggled socially. After graduating with a teaching degree from Florida State University, she returned to Naples and began working as a substitute teacher while pursuing her certification. It was during this period that the first red flags appeared. While examining Vanessa's employment records, Detective Sarah Reeves, who was assisting Mitchell on the case, discovered that Vanessa had abruptly left 3 different schools in the Naples area over a 4-year period. The official reasons cited were always vague, pursuing other opportunities or personal reasons, but the timing of each departure raised suspicions. Reeves made a crucial connection when she contacted the Human Resources Department at Westlake Academy, the last school where Vanessa had worked in Florida. The HR director was initially hesitant to share information beyond confirming employment dates, but when informed about the current investigation, she revealed that there had been an internal review regarding Vanessa's interactions with male students. Nothing was ever proven, the director explained over the phone, her voice lowered despite being alone in her office. But there were concerns about boundaries. She would offer to tutor certain students privately, always boys in their mid-teens. She gave gifts that seemed inappropriate for a teacher-student relationship. When questioned, she had plausible explanations for everything, and no student ever came forward with a complaint. The investigation had been inconclusive, but rather than face continued scrutiny, Vanessa had resigned. No formal report was filed with the Education Board, allowing her to maintain her teaching credentials, a critical oversight that had enabled her to continue working with minors. Further investigation revealed a pattern that extended beyond her professional life. Vanessa had a history of dating single fathers, particularly those with teenage sons. None of these relationships lasted longer than a year, and she typically moved to a different part of Florida after each breakup, effectively erasing her tracks each time. As Detective Reeves compiled this history, another officer discovered Vanessa's profile on multiple dating sites specifically targeting single parents. Her profiles emphasized her understanding of the challenges faced by widowed or divorced fathers raising teenage children. Robert Lawson had been her first victim outside of Florida, a calculated move that put more distance between her and her previous behavior patterns. Meanwhile, at Newark Liberty International Airport, Detective Mitchell coordinated with airport security and Border Patrol agents. They located Vanessa at a coffee shop near her departure gate, calmly sipping a latte and reading a magazine as if she had no concerns in the world. When approached by plainclothes officers, she initially maintained her composure, smiling pleasantly and asking what this was about. It wasn't until Mitchell himself appeared, holding up the arrest warrant, that her facade cracked. "You don't understand," she insisted as the handcuffs were secured around her wrists. "Tyler and I love each other. He initiated everything. He's mature for his age. He's not like other teenagers." As she was escorted through the terminal, Vanessa continued to justify her actions, shifting between claims of innocence and attempts to normalize her relationship with Tyler. Her statements were recorded and would later become damning evidence of her lack of remorse and distorted perception of appropriate boundaries with a minor. Back at the Lawson residence, Robert sat at his kitchen table surrounded by family photos that now seemed like artifacts from a counterfeit life. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs, for being so desperate to rebuild a family that he had invited a predator into their home. Child Protective Services had been notified as standard procedure, but the caseworker had quickly determined that Robert was not complicit in or aware of Vanessa's actions. Still, the shame he felt was overwhelming. "I was so focused on my own grief and loneliness," he confided to Detective Reeves during a follow-up interview. "Tyler was struggling after losing his mother, and I thought Vanessa was helping him. She would tell me about their conversations, about how she was getting through to him when I couldn't." His voice broke as he added, "I thanked her for it. I actually thanked her for what she was doing to my son." Tyler remained under the care of a trauma-informed psychologist who specialized in cases of sexual exploitation. The initial assessment indicated that Vanessa had employed classic grooming techniques, establishing trust, creating dependency, introducing secrecy, and gradually normalizing inappropriate behavior. She had exploited Tyler's grief over his mother's death, positioning herself not as a replacement maternal figure, but as something entirely different, someone who understood him in ways others couldn't. "She told me my dad wouldn't understand our connection," Tyler had revealed during his statement to the child psychologist. "She said that what we had was special, and that society just had arbitrary rules about age that didn't apply to us because we had a deeper understanding." The psychologist noted that this type of manipulation was textbook grooming language, designed to isolate the victim and create a false sense of maturity and agency. As the investigation continued, detectives discovered that Vanessa had been planning her escape for weeks. The apartment she had rented, the one where she took Tyler during fake therapy sessions, contained packed suitcases and multiple passports with her photo but different names. Financial records showed she had been transferring small amounts of money to an offshore account, building a fund that would have sustained her for months while avoiding detection. Most disturbing was a journal found in a locked drawer in the apartment. In it, Vanessa had documented her strategies for manipulating both Tyler and Robert, noting which approaches were most effective with each. She had recorded Tyler's vulnerabilities and how to exploit them, alongside observations about Robert's work schedule and when he was most distracted. The journal revealed a calculated predator, rather than someone caught up in inappropriate feelings. One entry read, "R working late again. Perfect opportunity for special time with T. He's becoming more attached, worried about my leaving. Using this to strengthen bond. Reminded him that our relationship is our secret adventure." The prosecution would later describe this journal as evidence of premeditation and calculated exploitation rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. It transformed the case from one that might have been plea bargained to one that would likely go to trial with multiple serious charges. 2 weeks after Vanessa's arrest at the airport, Detective Mitchell met with the district attorney's office to discuss the charges. The evidence was substantial. The grooming pattern documented in her journal, the explicit photos and videos recovered from her devices, Tyler's statement, the secret apartment, the false therapy appointments, and her attempted flight to avoid prosecution. "We're charging her with multiple counts," Assistant District Attorney Elena Vasquez explained, spreading the case files across her desk. "Sexual assault of a minor, endangering the welfare of a child, criminal sexual contact with a minor, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. Given the evidence of premeditation and the position of trust she abused, we're going for maximum penalties." The investigation had also turned up something unexpected, the source of the anonymous tip that had initiated the case. It came from Vanessa's former colleague at Westlake Academy, a teacher named Meredith Dunn, who had moved to New Jersey the previous year. Dunn had recognized Vanessa at a local grocery store and, aware of her concerning history with male students in Florida, had become alarmed when she learned Vanessa had married a man with a teenage son. "I should have reported my suspicions back in Florida," Dunn admitted when interviewed by Mitchell, "but everything was so nebulous then, and she was so good at explaining away concerns. When I saw her here with that boy, something in his expression reminded me of the students she used to mentor back in Westlake. I couldn't stay silent this time." As the case against Vanessa Lawson built, her defense attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would reduce her potential prison time. The prosecution, armed with the substantial evidence gathered by Mitchell's team, refused to budge on the most serious charges. The case was headed for trial, and Tyler would potentially need to testify against his stepmother, a prospect that caused the teenager significant distress, despite assurances that measures would be taken to minimize his trauma. Robert Lawson struggled to reconcile his failure to protect his son with his need to support Tyler's recovery. He took a leave of absence from work to attend family therapy sessions and consulted with specialists about how best to help Tyler process the exploitation and betrayal. The home they had shared with Vanessa became a painful reminder of what had happened, leading Robert to put it on the market and look for a fresh start elsewhere. As news of the case spread through the community, other families came forward with concerns about interactions their teenage sons had had with Vanessa during her brief time in New Jersey. She had volunteered at the local library's teen reading program and offered free tutoring services at the community center, positions that gave her access to vulnerable young men. While no additional victims were identified in New Jersey, these revelations painted a picture of a predator, methodically creating opportunities for exploitation. 3 months after her arrest, as Vanessa sat in the county jail awaiting trial, investigators made another significant discovery. A storage unit rented in her name contained boxes of mementos from previous relationships, photos, gifts, and journals documenting interactions with other teenage boys dating back nearly a decade. The evidence suggested that Tyler was not her first victim, but the latest in a series of calculated predatory relationships. This discovery prompted authorities in Florida to reopen investigations into Vanessa's past, particularly her time at the 3 schools, where she had abruptly ended her employment. The case was expanding beyond New Jersey's jurisdiction, raising the possibility of additional charges in Florida and a coordinated prosecution effort between the states. For Detective Mitchell, the case represented one of the most disturbing examples of predatory behavior he had encountered in his career. The level of calculation, the exploitation of grief and vulnerability, and the complete lack of remorse shown by Vanessa Lawson stood out even among the difficult cases he had handled over the years. As spring arrived in New Jersey, bringing renewal to the landscape, the Lawson family remained trapped in the winter of betrayal and exploitation. The legal process moved forward methodically, each hearing and filing bringing them closer to the trial that would expose the full extent of Vanessa's crimes. For Tyler, the journey toward healing had only just begun, complicated by the prospect of facing his abuser in court and having his exploitation become a matter of public record. The quiet suburban community that had once welcomed Vanessa as a widow's second chance at happiness now waited tensely for justice to be served. The case had shattered their sense of security and served as a stark reminder that predators could infiltrate even the most seemingly perfect families, hiding behind smiles and promises of healing while inflicting deep and lasting damage. As the prosecution prepared for the preliminary hearing, they received word that investigators in Florida had identified at least 2 previous victims of Vanessa's predatory behavior, both sons of men she had dated briefly. These young men, now in their early 20s, had never reported the abuse, carrying their trauma in silence. Their willingness to come forward now would significantly strengthen the case against Vanessa and ensure that her pattern of exploitation would finally be exposed and punished. The spring rains washed over New Jersey as Detective Mitchell drove to the Atlantic County Prosecutor's office. The windshield wipers created a hypnotic rhythm that matched the methodical progression of the case against Vanessa Lawson. What had begun as an investigation into one family's tragedy had expanded into a multi-state inquiry that uncovered a predator's decade-long trail of exploitation. District Attorney Elena Vasquez had assembled a joint task force with authorities in Florida to coordinate their efforts. Today's meeting would bring together investigators from both states to share information and develop a comprehensive strategy for prosecution. The case had grown far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. "We need to establish a clear timeline," Vasquez began once everyone was seated in the conference room. The walls were lined with cork boards displaying photographs, documents, and maps connected by red string, a visual representation of Vanessa's movements over the years. New Jersey will take the lead with the Lawson case, but Florida's evidence will establish pattern and intent. Detective Lauren Santos from the Naples Police Department had traveled north with 3 thick binders of evidence collected from Vanessa's time in Florida. "We've confirmed 2 additional victims," she explained, her slight accent revealing her Cuban heritage. "Both were the sons of men Vanessa dated between 2001 and 2004. Both were between 14 and 16 years old at the time of the abuse." Santos placed school yearbook photos on the table, 2 teenage boys with similar features to Tyler Lawson. All 3 shared the same basic physical type: slender build, dark hair, serious expressions. The pattern was unmistakable and disturbing. "Neither victim reported the abuse at the time," Santos continued. "Brandon Pierce came forward after seeing Vanessa's arrest on the news. He's 24 now, works as a graphic designer in Miami. He provided journal entries from that period that corroborate his account." The second victim, Ethan Winters, was identified through photographs in Vanessa's storage unit. He initially denied any inappropriate contact, but eventually confirmed the relationship during a follow-up interview. Mitchell studied the timeline they were constructing. Vanessa's predatory behavior appeared to have begun shortly after she completed her teaching degree. She had strategically positioned herself to access vulnerable teenage boys, first as a substitute teacher, then by targeting single fathers through dating apps. "What's remarkable is how she refined her methodology over time," noted Dr. Rebecca Linden, the forensic psychologist consulting on the case. "Her earlier approaches were less sophisticated. She made mistakes, left evidence, took risks that almost exposed her. By the time she reached the Lawson family, she had developed an extremely calculated approach with contingency plans and escape routes. The contents of Vanessa's storage unit had provided the most damning evidence of her long-term predatory behavior. Beyond the photographs and journals documenting her previous victims, investigators found a collection of books and printed articles about adolescent psychology. particularly focused on grief and trauma in teenage boys. Highlighted passages revealed her study of vulnerability markers and exploitation techniques. She was educating herself, Dr. Linden explained, learning how to identify and manipulate vulnerable teens more effectively. This wasn't opportunistic behavior. She was deliberately researching how to become a more efficient predator. Among the most disturbing items recovered was a notebook containing detailed observations about various teenage boys she had encountered through her teaching positions. The entries evaluated each boy's potential vulnerability, family situation, and her assessment of whether they could be successfully groomed. Some entries were marked with a simple yes or no, clinical evaluations of potential victims. The investigation had also uncovered Vanessa's digital footprint across various online forums where she had participated under pseudonyms. In these spaces, she had both sought and offered advice on forming special relationships with adolescent boys, using coded language to discuss grooming techniques while avoiding explicit acknowledgement of illegal activity. She was part of a network, Detective Santos explained, pulling up screenshots of these forum conversations. Not organized in the traditional sense, but a loose collection of individuals sharing techniques and validation. We're working with federal authorities to identify other participants in these forums. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the team methodically assembled the case that would be presented to the grand jury. The evidence from Florida would be introduced to establish Vanessa's pattern of behavior, strengthening the New Jersey prosecution's argument that her actions with Tyler Lawson were premeditated and part of a calculated victimization strategy rather than an isolated incident. Meanwhile, across town, Robert Lawson was meeting with a real estate agent to finalize the sale of their family home. The colonial with blue shutters that had once represented his attempt at rebuilding a family now stood as a monument to betrayal. He had found a smaller house in a neighboring county, hoping the change of environment would help Tyler begin to heal. The buyers are a young couple expecting their first child, the agent informed him as he signed the final papers. They're excited about starting their family here. Robert nodded silently, wondering if he should feel guilty about not disclosing the darkness that had permeated the walls of the seemingly perfect suburban home. But legally, he wasn't required to share that information, and he desperately needed the fresh start that the sale would provide. Tyler had returned to school after several weeks of absence, but opted for a modified schedule that minimized his interaction with other students. The school administration, aware of the situation, had implemented a support plan that included regular check-ins with the guidance counselor and accommodations for his coursework. Despite these measures, Tyler still encountered whispers and stares in the hallways. The case had received enough local media coverage that his peers were aware of the broad outlines, if not the specific details. Dr. Melissa Garner, the trauma specialist working with Tyler, had advised Robert that recovery would not follow a linear path. There will be good days and bad days, she had explained during their weekly parent consultation. The important thing is that Tyler knows he's not defined by what happened to him and that he has consistent support moving forward. One of the most difficult aspects of Tyler's recovery process was preparing him for the possibility of testifying at trial. The prosecution was working to minimize his direct involvement, using his recorded statements and the substantial physical evidence to build their case, but they couldn't guarantee that his testimony wouldn't be required. The uncertainty added another layer of anxiety to an already traumatic situation. By early summer, the preliminary legal proceedings were underway. Vanessa's defense attorney, Carlton Morris, a seasoned criminal defense lawyer known for handling high-profile cases, had initially attempted to portray Vanessa as mentally unstable, suggesting that a psychological defense might be pursued. This strategy collapsed when the prosecution presented evidence of her methodical planning and the calculated nature of her grooming process. Morris then pivoted to attacking the investigation itself, filing motions to suppress evidence from the storage unit and challenging the legality of the search warrants for Vanessa's electronic devices. These efforts largely failed, as Detective Mitchell had been meticulous in following proper procedures throughout the investigation. With these avenues closed, the defense made its first overture toward a plea agreement. "My client is willing to plead guilty to reduce charges," Morris proposed during a meeting with DA Vasquez. She recognizes that her relationship with Tyler Lawson was inappropriate and is prepared to accept responsibility for that specific incident. Vasquez's response was immediate and firm. "We're not interested in a deal that ignores the pattern of predatory behavior. The evidence from Florida will be presented, and your client will face charges for the full scope of her actions. As the case proceeded toward trial, the prosecution received an unexpected breakthrough. Meredith Dunn, the former colleague who had provided the anonymous tip, came forward with additional information. During Vanessa's time at Westlake Academy in Florida, the school had conducted an internal investigation into her behavior. Dunn had recently obtained copies of those records through a former administrator who had maintained personal files after retirement. The Westlake documents revealed that 3 sets of parents had raised concerns about Vanessa's interactions with their sons. The school had interviewed the students, but all had denied any inappropriate contact. The administration, wary of making accusations without conclusive evidence, had issued Vanessa a warning about maintaining proper professional boundaries. When similar concerns arose again 6 months later, they had given her the option to resign rather than face a more formal investigation. "This is the missing link," Mitchell noted as he reviewed the documents. "It explains why she left teaching but was able to maintain her credentials. The school was more concerned about potential liability than about reporting a possible predator to the authorities." The Westlake Academy records also included performance evaluations that noted Vanessa's particular skill in connecting with troubled male students. What had been viewed as a positive teaching attribute was, in retrospect, a warning sign of her targeting vulnerable boys. In July, 4 months after Vanessa's arrest, the grand jury returned indictments on all charges. In addition to the New Jersey charges related to Tyler Lawson, she now faced charges in Florida for her crimes against Brandon Pierce and Ethan Winters. The prosecution in both states would coordinate their efforts, with New Jersey proceeding to trial first. The indictment made headlines beyond the local news, attracting attention from national media outlets. The case touched on issues of gender bias in how society perceives sexual abuse, particularly when the perpetrator is female and the victim is male. Some commentators minimized the severity of Vanessa's actions, questioning whether a teenage boy could truly be victimized by an adult woman, while others pointed to the case as evidence that predatory behavior transcends gender. For the investigators and prosecutors, these public debates were irrelevant to the legal proceedings. The evidence was clear. Vanessa Lawson had systematically targeted and exploited vulnerable teenage boys over a period of years, causing significant psychological harm to her victims. As the trial date approached, Tyler's anxiety increased. Despite assurances from the prosecution that they would use his recorded statements whenever possible, his therapist noted regression in his progress. He began experiencing nightmares and panic attacks, particularly after learning that he might have to be in the same courtroom as Vanessa. Robert reached out to the families of the Florida victims, hoping to find insight from those who had already traveled the difficult road ahead of them. Brandon Pierce agreed to speak with them via video call, providing a perspective that neither Robert nor Tyler had considered. "The hardest part isn't the trial," Brandon explained, his face serious on the screen. "It's the years afterward when you're trying to figure out who you would have been if this hadn't happened to you. But I can tell you that it gets better. Not perfect, but better." This connection proved valuable for both Tyler and Robert. Brandon had spent years in therapy processing his experience and had eventually found a way to integrate it into his life narrative without allowing it to define him. His willingness to share his journey offered Tyler a roadmap for his own recovery and gave Robert hope that his son would eventually heal from this trauma. As August arrived, bringing oppressive humidity to the Garden State, the prosecution made one final attempt to spare Tyler from testifying. Dia Vasquez approached the defense with a modified plea offer. If Vanessa would plead guilty to all charges in New Jersey and provide a full confession, they would recommend a sentence at the lower end of the guidelines and coordinate with Florida prosecutors for concurrent rather than consecutive sentences. After consultation with his client, Morris returned with Vanessa's decision. She would not accept the plea deal. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, she maintained that her relationships with these boys had been consensual and meaningful, refusing to acknowledge the inherent power imbalance and the harm she had caused. "She believes she'll find sympathy from a jury," Morris admitted privately to Vasquez after delivering his client's decision. "She thinks her appearance and gender will work in her favor." The veteran defense attorney seemed troubled by his client's lack of insight, having advised her that the evidence against her was substantial and that a trial would likely result in maximum sentences. With negotiations failed, final preparations for trial began in earnest. The prosecution team met with Tyler and Robert to prepare them for what lay ahead. They would face Vanessa in court, would endure cross-examination from her defense attorney, and would have their private trauma exposed to public scrutiny. It was a devastating prospect, but one they would face together. Detective Mitchell, reviewing his case notes one evening in his office, reflected on the investigation that had consumed the past 5 months. The case had expanded far beyond that initial anonymous tip, revealing a predator who had operated undetected for years across multiple states. The evidence was comprehensive, the pattern clear, and the harm to the victims well documented. Yet, as he closed the file for the night, Mitchell couldn't help but wonder how many other Vanessa Lawsons were out there, refining their predatory techniques and hiding behind a facade of normalcy. How many other vulnerable teenagers were being groomed and exploited by those who had positioned themselves as mentors, friends, or family members? The Lawson case would soon move from investigation to prosecution. As Mitchell turned out his office light, he knew that the trial ahead would be difficult for everyone involved, particularly Tyler. But it would also finally bring Vanessa's decade-long pattern of exploitation to an end, and perhaps prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. The rain had stopped by the time Mitchell reached the parking lot, and the night air was heavy with humidity. Tomorrow would bring more developments, more preparations for the trial that would determine Vanessa Lawson's fate. For now, though, the detective could take some satisfaction in knowing that one predator's trail had been followed to its end. The Bergen County Courthouse stood imposing against the September sky, its stone facade a testament to the enduring nature of justice. Inside courtroom 3B, final preparations were underway for the trial of New Jersey versus Vanessa Lawson. The prosecution and defense teams arranged their materials at opposing tables, while the gallery gradually filled with journalists, legal observers, and a small contingent of supporters for the Lawson family. Detective Darren Mitchell sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, reviewing his notes one final time. In the month since Vanessa's arrest, he had interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed hundreds of pieces of evidence, and constructed a case that revealed not just the exploitation of Tyler Lawson, but a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years and crossing state lines. At 9:15 a.m., a side door opened, and Tyler entered with his father Robert and victim advocate Jessica Winters. The teenager's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as he took his seat. At 17, he was taller than when the investigation began, but his shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible. Robert placed a supportive hand on his son's shoulder, his own expression a mixture of determination and barely contained rage. When Vanessa was led in by court officers 10 minutes later, a palpable tension filled the room. She had transformed her appearance for the trial. Gone was the vibrant, confident woman who had charmed her way into the Lawson household. In her place stood a demure figure in a modest navy dress, her previously flowing auburn hair now pulled back in a simple ponytail. The calculated nature of this transformation was not lost on Mitchell, who had witnessed her manipulate appearances and perceptions throughout the investigation. Judge Harold Levine entered and called the court to order, beginning with preliminary instructions to the jury. The 12 men and women who would decide Vanessa's fate represented a cross-section of Bergen County, diverse in age, race, and occupation. They had been carefully selected through an extensive voir dire process, with both legal teams working to identify and exclude any potential jurors whose preconceptions might influence their assessment of the evidence. Assistant District Attorney Elena Vasquez rose for her opening statement, her crisp charcoal suit and measured movements conveying confidence and gravitas. "This case," she began, "is about the calculated exploitation of vulnerability. The evidence will show that the defendant, Vanessa Lawson, deliberately targeted teenage boys who were experiencing emotional trauma, particularly those who had lost a parent or were in unstable home environments." Vasquez outlined the prosecution's case methodically, explaining how they would demonstrate Vanessa's pattern of identifying, grooming, and exploiting vulnerable boys across multiple years and jurisdictions. "You will see evidence that this was not a spontaneous relationship or a momentary lapse in judgment. The defendant researched her victims, studied techniques to manipulate them, and documented her strategies. She created elaborate systems to conceal her activities and prepared escape plans when she feared discovery." The prosecutor then addressed what she anticipated would be the defense's strategy. "You may hear arguments about consent, about mature teenagers making choices, but I urge you to remember that in the eyes of the law, A 16-year-old cannot consent to sexual activity with an adult in a position of trust and authority. The power imbalance between a teenager and an adult caregiver makes genuine consent impossible. When defense attorney Carlton Morris took his turn, he adopted a tone of reasoned skepticism. The prosecution has painted my client as a calculating predator, but the evidence will show a more complex reality, he argued. Vanessa Lawson is a woman who formed inappropriate emotional attachments after experiencing her own history of trauma and instability. Her relationships with these young men, while legally and ethically problematic, were not the result of predatory calculation, but of profound psychological dysfunction. Morris's strategy became clear. He would not dispute the basic facts of Vanessa's relationships with the teenagers, but would instead challenge the prosecution's characterization of her intentions and mental state. By portraying Vanessa as herself a victim of psychological issues, he hoped to mitigate the severity of the charges and potential sentencing. The first week of trial focused on establishing the timeline of events in the Lawson household. Neighbors testified about their observations of the family dynamics. Teachers and counselors discussed the changes they had noted in Tyler's behavior, and digital forensics experts walked the jury through the evidence recovered from Vanessa's devices. The jury was shown the fake therapy appointment schedule Vanessa had created to justify time alone with Tyler, the secret apartment she had rented under a false name, and the explicit photographs and messages recovered from her phone. Each piece of evidence built a damning picture of calculated exploitation rather than impulsive behavior. Detective Mitchell took the stand on the trial's fifth day, providing a comprehensive overview of the investigation. He detailed how the anonymous tip had led to initial surveillance, the discovery of the secret apartment, and the recovery of Vanessa's journal documenting her grooming strategies. The journal contained explicit entries about how to gain Tyler's trust and dependency, Mitchell testified. There were notes about identifying his vulnerabilities, particularly his grief over his mother's death, and how to exploit those vulnerabilities to create emotional dependency. During cross-examination, Morris attempted to challenge Mitchell's characterization of the evidence. "Isn't it possible, detective, that this journal was simply a woman's private thoughts about a relationship she knew was inappropriate, but struggled to control?" Mitchell's response was measured but firm. The journal contained strategic planning, not emotional struggles. There were entries calculating when Robert Lawson would be traveling for work, notes on what gifts and privileges were most effective in securing Tyler's cooperation, and contingency plans for various scenarios including discovery. This shows premeditation, not impulsivity. The most challenging day of the trial came when Tyler Lawson took the stand. Despite the prosecution's efforts to use his recorded statements, the defense had successfully argued for their right to cross-examine him directly. The courtroom was cleared of spectators, except for essential personnel to create a less intimidating environment, but the fundamentally traumatic nature of the testimony remained. Tyler spoke softly but clearly as he described how Vanessa had gradually shifted from supportive stepmother to something entirely different. "At first she was just nice to me," he explained, his eyes fixed on Ada Vasquez rather than looking at the defense table where Vanessa sat. "She would listen when I talked about missing my mom. She seemed to understand in a way my dad couldn't." He described how Vanessa had created an impression of a special connection between them, something more mature than his relationships with peers. "She told me I was different from other guys my age, that I understood things they couldn't. When she started touching me differently, she said it was natural because of our special connection." The most devastating testimony came when Tyler described the psychological aftermath of the exploitation. "I thought I was special, that we had something real," he said, his voice breaking slightly. When the police explained that she had done this before, that there were notes about how to manipulate me, it made me feel stupid, like I'd been a project to her, not a person. During cross-examination, Morris approached Tyler with a practiced gentleness that barely concealed his tactical objectives. "Tyler, did Vanessa ever force you to do anything against your will? Did she ever threaten you or use physical coercion?" "No," Tyler admitted. "She didn't have to. She made me believe I wanted everything that happened. And you never told your father about your relationship with Vanessa because you believed it was something special between the two of you, correct?" "I kept it secret because she convinced me no one would understand. She said my dad would overreact and ruin what we had because society didn't accept relationships like ours." Despite Morris's attempts to frame the relationship as mutual and non-coercive, Tyler's testimony reinforced the prosecution's central argument. Vanessa had systematically manipulated a vulnerable teenager using sophisticated psychological tactics. The trial's momentum shifted dramatically in the second week when the prosecution called Dr. Kenneth Porter, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated the evidence in the case. Dr. Porter explained the concept of grooming to the jury in clear, accessible terms. Grooming is a process by which an offender gradually gains a person's trust and breaks down their defenses with the ultimate goal of sexual exploitation, he explained. It involves identifying vulnerabilities, filling emotional needs, isolating the victim from protective influences, gradually introducing sexual content or contact, and maintaining control through secrecy. Dr. Porter then methodically analyzed Vanessa's actions against this framework, demonstrating how each step of her interaction with Tyler followed the classic pattern of predatory grooming. He pointed to specific journal entries and text messages as examples of each stage in the process. What's particularly notable in this case, he concluded, is the defendant's self-awareness about her methodology. Her journal doesn't show someone struggling with inappropriate feelings. It shows someone documenting effective techniques for manipulation and exploitation. The defense's case began in the third week with testimony from Dr. Elaine Fraser, a clinical psychologist who had evaluated Vanessa after her arrest. Dr. Fraser testified that Vanessa exhibited signs of borderline personality disorder and attachment issues stemming from her own childhood experiences. Ms. Lawson's behavior, while inexcusable, can be understood in the context of her psychological profile, Dr. Fraser argued. She forms intense, unstable relationships and has difficulty maintaining appropriate boundaries. Her relationships with these young men represent a maladaptive attempt to establish connection rather than calculated predation. This testimony represented the core of the defense strategy, not to deny the inappropriate relationships, but to reframe them as the result of psychological dysfunction rather than predatory intent. Morris hoped this would open the door to consideration of diminished capacity and potentially mitigate sentencing. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Fraser was methodical and devastating. Adia Vasquez established that borderline personality disorder does not typically manifest in targeted exploitation of specific demographic groups, nor does it lead to the kind of detailed planning and documentation found in Vanessa's journals and electronic devices. Would someone suffering from the conditions you've described typically maintain meticulous records of manipulation strategies? Vasquez asked. Would they typically have escape plans prepared, including offshore accounts and false identification documents? Dr. Fraser was forced to concede that these behaviors suggested a level of calculation that went beyond the typical manifestations of borderline personality disorder. The defense suffered another setback when Brandon Pierce took the stand. Now 24, the graphic designer from Miami provided compelling testimony about his own experience as Vanessa's victim 7 years earlier. His account established the pattern of behavior that the prosecution had argued was central to understanding Vanessa's actions with Tyler. I was 14 when my dad started dating Vanessa, Brandon testified. My mom had died of cancer the year before, and I was angry at everyone, especially my dad, for moving on. Vanessa seemed to get that in a way no one else did. His testimony paralleled Tyler's in disturbing ways. The same gradual shift from supportive adult to inappropriate relationship, the same emphasis on their special connection, the same isolation from protective influences. The pattern was unmistakable and undermined the defense's argument that Vanessa's relationship with Tyler was an isolated incident resulting from psychological distress. As the trial entered its fourth week, the prosecution called Robert Lawson to testify. His testimony was perhaps the most emotionally charged of the proceedings, as he described how Vanessa had integrated herself into their family during a period of vulnerability. After my wife died, I was just trying to keep things together for Tyler, he explained, his voice steady despite the evident pain. Vanessa seemed to understand what we were going through. She talked about how she could help Tyler process his grief, how her background in education gave her insight into adolescent psychology. Robert described how Vanessa had gradually positioned herself as the primary emotional support for Tyler, encouraging Robert to focus on his work while she handled the parenting responsibilities. She told me Tyler was making progress in therapy that I later found out never happened. She would give me updates about his emotional state, his grief process. I trusted her completely with my son's well-being. When asked about the impact of Vanessa's actions on their family, Robert's composed facade briefly cracked. "She didn't just abuse my son. She used my grief and my desire to help him heal as tools to gain access to him. I invited her into our home, gave her my trust, my name." He paused, collecting himself. "The betrayal extends beyond what she did to Tyler. She betrayed the memory of my late wife by exploiting the void her death left in our family." In the final days of the trial, Vanessa Lawson took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony represented a significant gamble by the defense team, as it would open her to cross-examination. But Morris believed that allowing the jury to hear directly from her was necessary to humanize her in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Vanessa presented herself as a deeply troubled woman who had formed inappropriate emotional attachments to these teenage boys, but who had never intended harm. "I know now that what I did was wrong," she testified, her voice soft and occasionally breaking with apparent emotion. "I formed connections that weren't appropriate, and I'm truly sorry for any pain I've caused." She described her own childhood trauma, including abandonment by her father and emotional neglect from her mother, suggesting that these experiences had distorted her understanding of appropriate relationships and boundaries. "I was seeking connection and validation in the wrong places, with the wrong people." When questioned about the journal entries documenting her grooming strategies, Vanessa claimed they represented her attempts to understand her own inappropriate feelings rather than calculated plans for exploitation. "I was trying to make sense of why I was drawn to these relationships, trying to analyze my own behavior." Ada Vasquez's cross-examination was relentless. She walked Vanessa through the evidence of premeditation, the fake therapy appointments, the secret apartment, the offshore accounts, the research into non-extradition countries. With each example, Vanessa's claims of impulsive behavior driven by psychological dysfunction became less credible. "Ms. Lawson, are we to believe that your borderline personality disorder led you to research age of consent laws in different states?" Vasquez asked. "That your attachment issues prompted you to create elaborate fake identities and establish offshore accounts? That your emotional difficulties resulted in a storage unit containing mementos from multiple victims, organized by year and location?" By the time Vanessa left the stand, her credibility with the jury appeared significantly damaged. The calculated nature of her actions, documented in her own words and demonstrated through forensic evidence, stood in stark contrast to the image of psychological dysfunction she had attempted to present. In closing arguments, Morris made a final appeal to the jury to consider Vanessa's mental health issues as mitigating factors. "No one is suggesting that Ms. Lawson's actions were appropriate or legal," he acknowledged. "But justice requires understanding the context of behavior, not just its outward manifestation. My client's actions were driven by profound psychological disturbance, not calculated malice." Ada Vasquez's closing argument returned to the theme she had established in her opening, the calculated exploitation of vulnerability. "The evidence in this case is clear," she told the jury. "The defendant identified vulnerable teenage boys, studied techniques to manipulate them, documented her strategies, and took elaborate measures to conceal her activities. When she feared discovery, she had escape plans ready." Vasquez methodically reviewed the evidence presented over the past 4 weeks. The journal entries, the digital communications, the testimony from multiple victims describing the same pattern of behavior, and the expert analysis confirming the classic signs of predatory grooming. The defense would have you believe that Vanessa Lawson is herself a victim, driven by psychological dysfunction rather than predatory intent, Vasquez concluded. But the evidence tells a different story, one of calculation, manipulation, and the deliberate exploitation of vulnerable young men for her own gratification. Justice demands that she be held fully accountable for these choices and actions. As the jury began their deliberations, the Lawson family waited anxiously. For Tyler, the trial had been both traumatic and cathartic, forcing him to relive the exploitation, while also validating that he had been manipulated by someone who had studied and exploited his vulnerabilities. For Robert, the proceedings had reinforced his determination to help his son heal while dealing with his own sense of guilt for bringing Vanessa into their lives. The community that had followed the case closely now awaited the verdict, divided in their perspectives but united in their recognition of the profound breach of trust at the heart of the case. For Detective Mitchell and the prosecution team, the trial represented the culmination of months of investigation and preparation, but they knew that regardless of the outcome, the damage done to these young men and their families could never be fully repaired. As the courthouse emptied that evening, with the jury sequestered for deliberations, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the steps. Justice would soon render its verdict, but the shadow of betrayal would linger much longer for those whose trust had been so profoundly violated. The jury in New Jersey vs. Vanessa Lawson deliberated for just over 7 hours before reaching their verdict. As the courtroom filled on that crisp October morning, the tension was palpable. Tyler and Robert Lawson sat rigidly in the front row behind the prosecution table, while Detective Mitchell stood near the back wall, his expression unreadable as he watched the culmination of months of investigative work. When Judge Levine called the court to order, the forewoman of the jury stood, holding a slip of paper that would determine Vanessa's fate. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she read the verdict: guilty on all counts. Sexual assault of a minor, endangering the welfare of a child, criminal sexual contact, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. The jury had rejected the defense's psychological dysfunction argument and embraced the prosecution's portrayal of calculated predation. Vanessa showed little visible reaction to the verdict, maintaining the composed demeanor she had cultivated throughout the trial. Only a slight tightening of her jaw betrayed any emotional response. Her attorney immediately announced their intention to appeal, citing what he claimed were procedural errors in the admission of evidence from Florida. For the Lawson family, the verdict brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that Vanessa would face consequences for her actions, but no legal decision could erase the trauma that had been inflicted. As they left the courthouse surrounded by their support team, Robert's arm protectively around Tyler's shoulders, they declined to speak with the waiting media. Their focus now was on healing, not headlines. Detective Mitchell, however, did offer brief comments to the press. This case demonstrates the importance of recognizing that predatory behavior isn't limited by gender, he stated. The evidence showed a calculated pattern of exploitation that targeted vulnerable young men. Today's verdict affirms that our justice system recognizes the severity of these crimes regardless of who commits them. Judge Levine scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and pre-sentencing reports. In the interim, Vanessa remained in custody, denied bail due to the flight risk she had demonstrated prior to her arrest. The case had attracted national attention, sparking discussions about female predators, a topic often overlooked in conversations about sexual exploitation. Commentators noted the parallels between Vanessa's methods and those of male predators, who target vulnerable teenagers, challenging societal double standards that sometimes minimize the severity of female-perpetrated sexual crimes. For the prosecution team, the verdict represented only half their battle. They now turned their attention to ensuring an appropriate sentence that would reflect the severity of Vanessa's crimes and the calculated nature of her behavior. Ada Vasquez worked closely with her counterparts in Florida, coordinating their approach to the multiple cases spanning both states. While the New Jersey trial had focused primarily on Vanessa's exploitation of Tyler Lawson, the sentencing phase would incorporate evidence about her previous victims in Florida. The prosecution intended to present a comprehensive picture of a predator who had refined her techniques over years of targeting vulnerable teenage boys. In the weeks leading up to sentencing, more information about Vanessa's past emerged. Investigators in Florida had identified a third potential victim, another teenage son of a man Vanessa had briefly dated. Now in his mid-20s and serving in the military, he initially declined to make a formal statement, but eventually provided a written account of his experiences that corroborated the pattern observed with other victims. The pre-sentencing investigation also uncovered troubling details about Vanessa's childhood that complicated but didn't excuse her behavior. Records indicated that she had been sexually abused by an older family friend when she was 13, a trauma she had never reported and that apparently went unaddressed. Mental health experts consulted by both the prosecution and defense acknowledged this as a significant factor in her psychological development, but disagreed about its relevance to her adult predatory behavior. Dr. Rebecca Linden, the forensic psychologist who had consulted on the case, noted in her report to the court that childhood victimization sometimes creates distorted perceptions about age-appropriate relationships. However, she wrote, Ms. Lawson's behavior goes far beyond distorted perceptions. The calculated nature of her victim selection, grooming techniques, and concealment efforts demonstrates a level of predatory intent that cannot be attributed solely to her own past trauma. As the sentencing date approached, both Tyler and Robert prepared victim impact statements. For Tyler, this represented another difficult but important step in his healing process. With the support of his therapist, Dr. Melissa Garner, he worked through multiple drafts, struggling to articulate the profound impact of Vanessa's exploitation without allowing it to define him. "I want the judge to understand what she took from me," Tyler explained during a therapy session. "Not just my trust or my sense of safety, but my belief in my own judgment. For months, I thought I was making choices, that I had some kind of control or agency. Learning that every interaction was calculated, that she was studying how to manipulate me, it makes me question everything about myself." Dr. Garner had observed significant progress in Tyler's recovery since the trial. The validation of the guilty verdict had helped him recognize that he wasn't responsible for what had happened. The court saying this was done to you, rather than this happened between you, makes a difference in how victims process their experiences, she noted in her case notes. Robert's impact statement focused on the broader devastation to their family, the betrayal of trust, the exploitation of their grief over his late wife's death, and the ongoing challenge of rebuilding their lives. "Vanessa didn't just target my son," he wrote. "She targeted our vulnerability as a family trying to heal from loss. She positioned herself as a source of healing while inflicting new trauma." On the morning of sentencing, the courthouse was again filled with observers. The case had become a focal point for discussions about predatory behavior, gender bias in the justice system, and the protection of vulnerable teenagers. Advocacy groups focused on child protection had filed amicus briefs urging a sentence that would reflect the gravity of the crimes and serve as a deterrent to other potential offenders. Judge Levine began the proceedings by addressing the courtroom. "This case has garnered significant public attention, but my responsibility is to apply the law to the specific facts and circumstances before me, not to make a broader social statement. That said, the facts in this case are particularly disturbing and warrant careful consideration." The judge then invited victim impact statements, beginning with Tyler Lawson. Tyler approached the podium, his posture straighter than it had been during the trial. At 17, he stood on the threshold of adulthood, preparing to graduate high school in the spring and move forward with his life. The past year had aged him in ways beyond the physical. "When I was little and had nightmares," Tyler began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "my mum would tell me that monsters weren't real. After she died, I stopped believing in a lot of things, but I still believed that real monsters didn't exist. Vanessa proved me wrong." He described how the exploitation had affected his ability to trust, his relationships with peers, and his sense of self. "The hardest part isn't what happened. It's knowing that every moment that felt real to me was calculated. Every time I thought I was connecting with someone who understood me, she was actually following a script she'd written based on studying how to manipulate kids like me." Tyler concluded with a statement that moved many in the courtroom. "I'm not going to let what Vanessa did define my future. But I want the court to understand that her actions didn't just break the law, they broke something in me that I'm still trying to fix. And I'm not the only one. There are others like me who haven't had their day in court, who haven't had their experiences validated. I'm speaking for them too." Robert Lawson followed with his own statement, addressing both the personal impact on their family and the broader implications of Vanessa's behavior. "As a parent, your fundamental responsibility is to protect your child. I invited this predator into our home, gave her access to my son during the most vulnerable period of his life. That's a weight I'll carry forever." He spoke about the ripple effects of Vanessa's crimes, how they had forced the family to relocate, how Tyler had lost his final years of normal high school experience, how their trust in others had been fundamentally damaged. "We're not just victims of sexual crimes. We're victims of an elaborate betrayal that exploited our grief and vulnerability in the most profound way imaginable." Brandon Pierce had traveled from Florida to deliver his impact statement in person, representing not only himself, but also other victims who were unable or unwilling to speak publicly. Now 24, he had spent a decade processing the exploitation he had experienced at Vanessa's hands. "When I was 14, Brandon testified, I believed that what was happening between me and Vanessa was special, different from the experiences of other kids my age. It's taken years of therapy for me to understand that I was targeted specifically because of my vulnerability after losing my mother, that the connection I felt was manufactured through calculated manipulation." He described the long-term impact on his ability to form healthy relationships, his struggles with intimacy and trust, and the shame that had prevented him from disclosing the abuse for years. The damage doesn't end when the abuse stops. It continues to shape your perceptions of yourself and others in ways that take years to unravel and address. After the victim statements, Ada Vasquez presented the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. She emphasized the calculated nature of Vanessa's crimes, the pattern of behavior established across multiple victims, and the particular vulnerability of the teenagers she had targeted. The evidence shows that the defendant selected victims based on specific vulnerabilities, particularly boys who had lost a parent, and developed sophisticated techniques to manipulate and exploit them, Vasquez argued. The pre-sentencing investigation reveals no mitigating factors that would justify leniency. Therefore, the state recommends the maximum sentence allowed under the law. Defense attorney Carlton Morris presented a markedly different perspective, acknowledging the severity of the crimes, but arguing for consideration of Vanessa's own history of victimization and psychological issues. While we respect the jury's verdict, we ask the court to consider the complex psychological factors that contributed to Ms. Lawson's behavior. Her own childhood trauma created distorted perceptions about relationships that, while not excusing her actions, provide context that should inform sentencing. Morris also emphasized Vanessa's lack of prior criminal record and presented letters from former colleagues and friends attesting to positive aspects of her character. These submissions were met with skeptical expressions from the prosecution table, given the evidence of Vanessa's long-term pattern of exploitation that had simply gone unreported. Before pronouncing the sentence, Judge Levine offered Vanessa an opportunity to address the court. She rose slowly, her appearance now a stark contrast to both the confident woman who had infiltrated the Lawson household and the demure figure she had presented during the trial. The months in custody had diminished her, with dark circles under her eyes and her once vibrant hair now dull and showing gray at the roots. "I recognize that my actions have caused pain," Vanessa stated, her voice betraying little emotion. "I never intended to harm anyone. I formed inappropriate attachments and relationships that I now understand were wrong. I'm committed to addressing my psychological issues and ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again." Her statement was notable for what it didn't include: a direct apology to her victims, an acknowledgement of the calculated nature of her behavior, or any real indication of remorse beyond recognition that her actions had been legally wrong. The absence of genuine contrition was not lost on Judge Levine. After a brief recess to consider all statements and recommendations, the judge returned to deliver the sentence. "Ms. Lawson," he began, "this court has carefully considered all factors in this case, including the nature and circumstances of the crimes, the impact on the victims, your personal history, and the need to protect society from further harm." He continued, "The evidence presented at trial and in pre-sentencing reports reveals a disturbing pattern of calculated predatory behavior targeting specifically vulnerable teenagers. Your journal entries, digital communications, and the testimony of multiple victims established that these were not impulsive actions or the result of boundary confusion, but deliberate exploitation." Judge Levine noted the particular breach of trust involved in Vanessa's crimes. "You positioned yourself as a supportive parental figure to gain access to these young men during periods of significant emotional vulnerability. You exploited their grief and need for connection in a manner that this court finds particularly reprehensible." He then addressed Vanessa's own history of victimization. "The court acknowledges that you experienced trauma in your own childhood that may have contributed to distorted perceptions about relationships. However, the calculated nature of your victim selection, grooming methods, and concealment efforts demonstrates a level of awareness that cannot be attributed to unconscious psychological processes." The sentence, when delivered, represented the severe end of the sentencing guidelines: 15 years for the sexual assault charge, with additional consecutive sentences for the other charges, totaling 23 years in state prison. Additionally, Vanessa would be required to register as a sex offender upon release, would be subject to lifetime parole supervision, and would be permanently barred from any employment or volunteer positions involving minors. This sentence reflects both the gravity of the crimes committed and the need to protect vulnerable young people from future harm, Judge Levine concluded. It also sends a clear message that our society and legal system recognize the serious nature of these offenses regardless of the gender of the perpetrator or victims. As Vanessa was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her face remained impassive. The prosecution team exchanged subdued handshakes, acknowledging the successful conclusion of the case while recognizing that no legal outcome could fully address the harm that had been done. For them, the focus would now shift to the Florida prosecutions, ensuring that Vanessa would face justice for her earlier victims as well. For the Lawson family, the sentencing represented a milestone in their journey, but not its conclusion. As they left the courthouse for the final time, Robert and Tyler declined further media requests, choosing instead to begin the process of reclaiming their privacy and rebuilding their lives away from the public scrutiny that had surrounded the case. Detective Mitchell watched them depart, reflecting on the complex aftermath of predatory crimes. Justice had been served in legal terms, but the ripple effects of Vanessa's actions would continue to impact these families for years to come. Still, there was some satisfaction in knowing that her pattern of exploitation had been stopped, that potential future victims had been protected, and that the young men she had targeted had been validated by the justice system's response. As reporters dispersed and the courthouse emptied, the case of New Jersey vs. Vanessa Lawson officially concluded. The legal system had processed the evidence, rendered its judgment, and imposed its consequences. Now, the harder work of healing could continue for those whose lives had been forever altered by a predator who had masked herself as a caregiver, exploiting vulnerability under the guise of providing support. In the days following sentencing, Florida prosecutors announced their intention to proceed with their own cases against Vanessa, ensuring that her earlier victims would also have their day in court. The pattern of justice would continue, addressing the full scope of a predatory history that had finally been exposed and stopped. 5 years had passed since the sentencing of Vanessa Lawson. The courthouse that had once been filled with reporters and spectators now hosted different cases, different dramas. Yet the ripple effects of the Lawson case continued to spread through the lives of those involved and beyond the immediate circle of victims and their families. On a mild spring morning in 2011, Detective Darren Mitchell, now Lieutenant Mitchell and head of the Bergen County Special Victims Unit, sat at an unfamiliar desk reviewing case files. The room around him bore little resemblance to his former office. This space was brighter, with educational posters on the walls and a small table with child-sized chairs in the corner. The Center for Protection and Recovery had opened 2 years earlier, a direct result of the awareness raised by the Lawson case and similar high-profile prosecutions. The center represented a new approach to handling cases involving sexual exploitation, bringing together law enforcement, victim advocates, therapists, and prosecutors under one roof to provide comprehensive support for survivors while building stronger cases against perpetrators. Mitchell had been instrumental in its creation, leveraging his experience with the Lawson case to advocate for systemic improvements in how such cases were handled. A knock at the door interrupted his review. Elena Vasquez, who had prosecuted Vanessa Lawson and now served as the county's district attorney, entered with a tablet in hand. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said, passing him the device. "Florida Supreme Court denied Lawson's final appeal yesterday. The convictions there will stand." Mitchell nodded with satisfaction. After the New Jersey conviction, Florida prosecutors had successfully tried Vanessa for her crimes against Brandon Pierce and Ethan Winters, resulting in additional sentences to be served consecutively with her New Jersey term. The combined sentences ensured that Vanessa would remain incarcerated well into her 60s. "How are the Lawsons doing?" Vasquez asked, taking a seat across from Mitchell. "Still in touch?" "Robert emails occasionally," Mitchell replied. "Tyler graduated from college last year, psychology major. He's working at a youth counseling center in Chicago now." This was the outcome that gave Mitchell the most satisfaction, seeing a victim not only survive but thrive, transforming their traumatic experience into something that could help others. Tyler Lawson had indeed been changed by what happened to him, but not in the way Vanessa had intended. Instead of remaining a victim, he had reclaimed his agency and was using his experience to support other young people navigating trauma and recovery. Across the country in Chicago, Tyler Lawson, now 22, stood before a small group of teenage boys in a community center meeting room. His posture was confident, his expression open and engaged, as he led a support group for young men who had experienced various forms of trauma and exploitation. "One of the most important things to understand," Tyler was saying, "is that trauma doesn't define you. It's something that happened to you, not something that determines who you are or who you can become. The group nodded, some making eye contact, others studying the floor. Tyler recognized the range of responses. He had exhibited all of them himself during his own recovery process. The youngest boy in the circle, maybe 14, raised his hand hesitantly. But how do you stop feeling stupid about it? Like, how do you not hate yourself for not seeing what was happening? The question struck a familiar chord. Tyler had asked the same question countless times during his years of therapy with Dr. Garner. That's one of the hardest parts, Tyler acknowledged. Predators are skilled at manipulation. They study how to make you believe you're making choices when you're actually being guided down a path they've carefully designed. The guilt and self-blame are normal reactions, but they're based on a false premise that you should have been able to recognize and resist manipulation specifically designed to be unrecognizable to you. After the session, Tyler met with his supervisor, Dr. Alicia Patel, to discuss the group's progress. At 39, Dr. Patel had been working with trauma survivors for over 15 years and had become an important mentor for Tyler as he developed his skills as a peer counselor. "You're making remarkable progress with them," she noted as they reviewed his session notes. "Especially with Marcus. He's starting to engage more than I've seen in the 6 months he's been coming here." Tyler nodded. "He reminds me a lot of myself at that age. The anger, the self-blame, the isolation. I recognize it all." "That's why you're so effective," Dr. Patel replied. "You offer them something the rest of us can't, genuine understanding from someone who's walked a similar path. Speaking of which, have you given more thought to our conversation about graduate school? The application deadline for the fall semester is coming up." Tyler had indeed been considering taking the next step in his career. His undergraduate work in psychology had provided a theoretical foundation, but he wanted to gain the clinical training that would allow him to work more extensively with trauma survivors. Dr. Patel had been encouraging him to apply to the clinical psychology program at Northwestern, where she held an adjunct position. "I'm finishing the personal statement this weekend," Tyler confirmed. "Dad's coming to visit next week and he wants to read it before I submit the application." His relationship with his father had evolved significantly over the years following Vanessa's trial. Initial tension and mutual guilt had gradually transformed into a deeper connection as they both worked through the aftermath of betrayal. Robert had eventually remarried, a colleague from his software company named Sarah, who had approached their relationship with patience and respect for the trauma they had experienced. Tyler had served as best man at their wedding 3 years earlier. Later that evening, Tyler returned to his small apartment in Wicker Park, a neighborhood that had become home during his undergraduate years at DePaul University. As he prepared dinner, his phone rang, Brandon Pierce calling from Miami. The two had maintained contact since the trial, their shared experience creating a unique bond, despite the geographic distance between them. "Just checking in," Brandon said after they exchanged greetings. "Today's always a weird anniversary for me." Tyler had almost forgotten. It was April 17th, the date Vanessa had been sentenced in Florida after her New Jersey conviction. For Brandon, who had waited years longer for justice, the date held particular significance. "How are you handling it?" Tyler asked, setting aside his cooking to focus on the conversation. "Better than last year," Brandon replied. "Therapy helps. The new job helps too. Keeps me busy, focused on the future instead of the past." "How about you? Still planning to apply to grad school?" Their conversation continued as they updated each other on their lives, careers, and recovery journeys. Brandon had recently become engaged and was working as an art director at a digital marketing firm. His fiancée knew about his history and had been supportive of his ongoing therapy and occasional difficult days. "You know what's strange?" Brandon said toward the end of their call. "Sometimes I almost feel grateful for what happened, not for the abuse itself, obviously, but for how it connected us to each other and to the other survivors we've met through the advocacy work. There's a community that came out of all this horror, people supporting each other in ways that wouldn't have happened otherwise." Tyler understood the sentiment. The network of survivors, advocates, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals that had formed in the wake of the Lawson case had become an important part of his life and recovery. The trauma remained a part of his story, but it no longer defined him or limited his future. In Trenton, New Jersey, Robert Lawson sat in his home office finalizing travel arrangements for his upcoming trip to Chicago. At 54, he had aged well, though threads of silver now dominated his dark hair. The wall behind his desk displayed family photos, including recent additions featuring his wife Sarah and her 2 adult children from a previous marriage. Among them was a photograph of Tyler at his college graduation, his smile genuine and his eyes clear of the shadows that had haunted them for years after Vanessa's arrest. Sarah entered with 2 cups of coffee, placing one on Robert's desk before settling into the adjacent reading chair with her own. "Excited to see Tyler?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The father-son relationship had become a cornerstone of both their lives. "Always," Robert replied with a smile. "He's sending me his graduate school application essay to review. Says he wants my input before submitting it." "He values your perspective," Sarah noted. "That says a lot about how far you've both come." Indeed, the journey had been long and often difficult. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, Robert had been consumed by guilt over his failure to recognize Vanessa's predatory behavior. Therapy had helped him understand that he too had been a victim of her manipulation, that the calculated nature of her deception had been designed specifically to exploit his grief and desire to help his son heal from the loss of his mother. The healing process had not been linear. There had been setbacks, periods of depression, and moments when the weight of what had happened threatened to overwhelm both father and son. Yet they had persisted, supported by professionals and eventually by Sarah, whose patient understanding had helped rebuild Robert's capacity for trust. As Robert prepared for his trip to Chicago, he reflected on the unexpected ways his life had changed since that cold November morning when Detective Mitchell had first appeared at their door. The pain remained, a scar that would never completely fade, but alongside it had grown a deeper appreciation for resilience, for genuine connection, and for the possibility of healing even after profound betrayal. Across the country at the California Institution for Women, Vanessa Lawson sat alone in the facility's library, a privilege earned through years of compliant behavior. At 44, her once vibrant appearance had faded, her auburn hair now streaked with gray, and her face lined by years of incarceration. She was 12 years into her combined sentences, with at least 15 more ahead, before she would be eligible for parole consideration. The rehabilitation programs she had participated in had given her insight into the harm she had caused, though whether this represented genuine remorse or calculated behavior aimed at improving her prison conditions remained unclear to those who evaluated her progress. Her therapist noted that Vanessa still occasionally minimized her actions or deflected responsibility, suggesting that her understanding of the damage she had inflicted remained incomplete. What was certain was that she would never again have the opportunity to exploit vulnerable teenagers. Her name was now included in sex offender registries, her crimes documented in case studies used to train law enforcement officers about predatory grooming techniques, her methods analyzed to help parents and educators recognize warning signs of exploitation. In this way, even her incarceration served a purpose in protecting potential future victims. Back in Bergen County, the Center for Protection and Recovery continued its work with current victims while advocating for systemic changes to prevent future exploitation. The center had become a model for similar programs across the country, demonstrating the effectiveness of collaborative approaches to addressing sexual crimes against minors. Lieutenant Mitchell's office wall now displayed a framed letter from Tyler Lawson, sent after his college graduation. "What happened to me will always be part of my story," Tyler had written, "but thanks to people like you, it's no longer the defining chapter. I'm writing my own story now, one that I hope will help others reclaim their narratives too." This, Mitchell reflected as he prepared to interview a nervous 12-year-old about disturbing messages she had received online, was the true measure of justice. Not just the punishment of perpetrators, but the recovery and empowerment of survivors. The system wasn't perfect. Too many predators still escaped detection. Too many victims still suffered in silence. But cases like Vanessa Lawson's had advanced the conversation, improved the protocols, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrated to survivors that they were not alone, that healing was possible, and that their experiences would be believed and addressed. In Chicago, as twilight fell over the city, Tyler Lawson sat at his desk finalizing his personal statement for graduate school. The document traced his journey from victim to advocate, from trauma to recovery, from isolation to connection. It was not the life path he would have chosen, but it was one that now held meaning and purpose. The final paragraph read, "My experience as a survivor of sexual exploitation has taught me that trauma need not be a life sentence. With appropriate support and intervention, survivors can reclaim their agency and transform their experiences into sources of empathy, insight, and strength. As a clinical psychologist, I hope to contribute to this transformation for others, creating spaces where healing becomes possible even after profound betrayal. Justice matters, but beyond justice lies the more complex and ultimately more important work of recovery. He saved the document and closed his laptop, glancing at the photograph on his desk, himself with his father and Sarah at their wedding, all three smiling genuinely despite the shadows of the past. Beside it stood another frame containing a quote that Dr. Garner had given him years earlier, words that had sustained him through the darkest periods of his recovery. Healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls your life. As the lights of Chicago illuminated the gathering darkness outside his window, Tyler reflected on the long journey from that suburban New Jersey home to this moment. Vanessa Lawson had intended to define his life through exploitation and manipulation. Instead, he had reclaimed his narrative and transformed it into something meaningful, not despite what had happened to him, but because of his refusal to be defined by it. The case of Vanessa Lawson, the predator who had infiltrated a grieving family under the guise of healing, had long since faded from headlines, but its impact continued to resonate through improved protocols for identifying and prosecuting similar crimes, through support systems for survivors, and through the lives of those who had been forever changed by the experience. Justice had been served in the courtroom years earlier, but its true fulfillment could be seen in Tyler Lawson's quiet determination to transform his trauma into a force for healing, in Robert's rebuilt capacity for trust and connection, in Brandon Pierce's engagement and career success, and in the countless invisible ripples that continued to spread from their shared experience of survivorship. In the end, Vanessa Lawson had failed in her ultimate goal. She had sought to exploit vulnerability for her own gratification, to manipulate and control. Instead, her victims had reclaimed their agency, their voices, and their futures. The damage she had inflicted remained real, the scars permanent, but they no longer defined or limited those she had targeted. That, perhaps, was the most meaningful justice of all.